It's a year of blessing. This past year was difficult in so many ways, and I hope that as we're reflecting on it, we can also discover the blessings that surely came to us in spite of all the difficulties. But I'm so thrilled that we have the opportunity to pray together and to sing together, and I pray that this new year will be a year of goodness for you and for your family, for our congregation, for me and my family, for our whole people, and for the whole world. So Shana Tova. I want to share some thoughts with you about a central concept on Rosh Hashanah, and I want to begin this way. As a baby, Moses sat on Pharaoh's lap during a meeting of the king's counselors, we learn in the Midrash. And during the proceedings, the little baby reaches up and takes the crown off of Pharaoh's head. The counselors stand aghast all around, and an angel intervenes to assure that no harm comes to the boy. The story teaches us an essential fact. Moses is interested in exposing falsehood, even as a baby. It was false that Pharaoh was all-powerful, and a lie that he was a person to be honored. Childish mischief eventually becomes spiritual revolution, and eventually Moses would indeed remove Pharaoh's crown. The poor, bedraggled people who were enslaved to the king would declare at their redemption, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Ve'ed. God will be king forever and ever. God will be sovereign forever and ever. And they would themselves, this people, eventually become declared a Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The last Pharaoh died 2,000 years ago, and here we are, you and I, and the Jewish people, celebrating and acclaiming Melech HaOlam, the sovereign of the world. In our time, that phrase, Melech HaOlam, king of the world or sovereign of the world, has been rightly challenged for being anachronistic and for being patriarchal. Why does that concept play such a central place in the liturgy of the high holidays and on Rosh Hashanah in the way that it does? And you'll notice throughout the prayers that the word melech, the word king or sovereign as it's translated in our machzor, plays a really central role in our liturgy. And in fact, the two opening distinguishing features of the Yom Kippur of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, that is, those features that distinguish it from the rest of the prayers of the year, are at the end of the Pusikei de Zimra, where the Chazan begins with Ha-Melech, meaning the sovereign, and then also at the beginning of the Amidah, there are also words added there to the same effect. So what is this idea of God as sovereign that is so central to Rosh Hashanah, and what does it come to teach us? So some find the metaphor difficult, as I said, because they reject a God who seems to desire recognition as king. But I believe that this metaphor, in spite of some of its confusing aspects, has power, because if only God is sovereign, then nothing else is sovereign. And notice perhaps that even more important than God's sovereignty is our recognition of God's sovereignty, which also plays a central role in the liturgy. If we grant God sovereignty, then we can grant nothing else sovereignty. It is in our willingness to grant sovereignty to God, to recognize God as the sovereign ruler of the world, that we take our place as moral beings in the Jewish tradition. The special status of the Jewish people in the world is a source of pride. Our endurance of suffering led us to the heights of Mount Sinai, where we received a document that brought together heaven and earth in the creation of a holy society. Now, in exile, our task is to hold on to what makes us special and to preserve our distinct ways, beliefs, and habits. This, anyway, is the narrative that we usually understand it. But I want to complicate it a little bit by suggesting that there are aspects of idolatry. Yes, idolatry within it. A performative gesture, sometimes our tradition can be, one of self-glorification. And if we move in that direction during our worship, then indeed it is a mode of idolatry. It misses the mark if we simply celebrate the special status of the Jewish people and essentially honor ourselves. It's not the Jewish people who are special. It is our God and the Torah that God gave us. The tractate of the Talmud that deals with idolatry, called Avodah Zarah, which means idolatry, on its very first daf, the very first page, tells us that God offered the Torah to every nation before finally offering it to the Jewish people, who said, yes, we will accept the Torah. It was only us who said yes, and this message echoes another thing we see, which is God's threat to the Jewish people, that if we do not heed the Torah's demands to create a holy and righteous and just society, then we forfeit God's assurance of a life of blessing in the land that we were promised. What clearer message could there be that it is not our past that makes us great, but rather our willingness to crown God as sovereign in the present? And yet, too often we have not. We do not. Among the idolatries of which the Jewish people are guilty, the acceptance of an imperatives of an immoral society is perhaps the most dangerous. When our forebears worshipped small carved figurines or sacrificed to foreign gods, they were at least clear that they had cast their lot with other divinities. But because our no gods, to quote our tradition, do not look like gods, we suffer under the illusion that we can be faithful Jews and still serve these other idols. I mention this because I feel urgently that now is a moment for Jewish leadership, not leaders of the mold of rabbis or Jewish professionals, but of all Jews. We are at a crossroads as a people, I believe, at least in North America and in the West. And if we misunderstand the meaning of our past, we will betray our future. The Jewish people are in a particular position to offer moral leadership and to stand as heroic teachers in the moral chaos of our day. And I fear that by misinterpreting our own past, we will step down from the position of leadership to which we have been called by our own tradition. Like Moses, we sit in the lap of a false king. Will we remove the crown? What is this false king? What is the Pharaoh of our day? Anything that tramples the humanity of human beings created B'Tselem Elohim, who are created in the divine image. That was how our rabbis understood God's hostility to other nations in the Torah. Those nations sold life on the cheap. They brutalized people within their societies. They dehumanized one another. They glorified violence, and they accepted or even pursued injustice. Do we think that we are immune to falling into such habits? When a society is in thrall to what has been, it sees what is as inevitable and bows down to circumstance like a god, as though it were unchangeable. But only one thing in Jewish life is unchangeable, and that is God. When we treat injustice as inevitable, poverty is unavoidable, racism is justifiable, when we are more concerned about the violent behavior of a few rioters than the moral violence of day-to-day life in our society, when we long for an order on the streets at the expense of the moral order of the communities within which we live, when we are undisturbed and sleep peacefully at night, when immigrants are being brutalized and young children, are being held in jails separate from their parents, when we passively accept the dictates of an unholy society, then we no longer deserve the title a nation of priests, because by accepting the arbitrary violence of power and of class and of money, we leave the crown upon Pharaoh's head. We no longer recognize God's sovereignty. Now, some will protest that the Torah addresses itself to the Jewish people alone, and its vision of a holy society addresses itself to one that should one day be built in the land of Israel. And therefore, we are not bound, according to this line of thinking, by the obligation to make God's vision real here in the societies in which we live in the diaspora. But can it truly be, that in the 80 generations that have passed since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that we are simply biding our time, and that we should view ourselves as being morally free to bind ourselves to the gods around us? Or can we so bifurcate our lives that we believe we are privately to accept God's will, but not to honor the divine by sharing God's moral demands on our public lives? Others will say that the Torah and politics should never mix. Rabbis and congregations should not concern themselves with Black Lives Matter, for example, with issues of public poverty and the like. And I confess that such a view is incomprehensible to me. I am sympathetic to the concerns that underlie it, but I do not know how to avoid the conclusion that Torah concerns itself with what we now call politics. Just a few examples will illustrate the point. God floods the world in the book of Genesis because the earth had become filled with lawlessness and violence. Sodom and Gomorrah, God is concerned with the moral failings of those societies, and so destroys these twin towns in southern Israel. And Egypt, God uses Moses to disrupt one of the great monarchies of the ancient Middle East and to destroy it for its evil nature. And the prophets repeatedly warn the Jewish people that they will be cast into exile for their moral failures and tolerance of injustice. And in fact, God speaks through Isaiah in the Rosh Hashanah Haftarah reading, telling us to pay less attention to the religious rituals and more attention to our treatment of the poor and to the vulnerable. The entire Gemara is about how to create a society economically, judicially, culturally, of moral dignity and sensitivity. The idea that Torah should not speak to politics is, in my estimation, an entirely modern idea that is totally foreign to the Torah itself. It's not that the Torah ought to be political. The Torah is essentially political. And I know that for some of you it is frustrating to hear a message like this on the new year. We want and deserve inspiration and uplift from our Torah and from our rabbis. But the magnificent demands that we crown God as king are the very essence of Rosh Hashanah. And as partners with God in creation, we live in the world whose creation we celebrate on this day. And we either do or we do not accept responsibility for ensuring that God is sovereign in the world. Our responsibility is staggering. God is indeed sovereign by nature, but without human recognition of God's holiness, without our tearing down every false god, everything from idolatrous thought that diminishes humanity to every deed that follows from it, prevents God's reign. Our teshuvah comes through our recognition of God's sovereignty. It is not easy to live a life that testifies to that truth and that truth alone. But that is the Jewish challenge and the challenge of this holy day. To be sure, the Torah's politics are not left, they're not right. The Torah is political, but it does not focus on policy. But left or right, each of us must be working for the elevation of the society within which we live. That means we have to be willing to call out evil policies and decisions and deceptions that hurt or damage the communities within which we live and that affect other people, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. Working against dehumanization and against authoritarianism, against brutality, against white supremacy, against racism, against the worship of financial markets, against plutocracy, actively working to undermine all of these idolatries in order to recognize the humanity of every person and to empower every person to elevate their lives, should that not be the task of the human being, and should not Jews have a special role to play? We cannot talk about any of this without talking about Jewish suffering. We have been the eternal pariah in Western culture. Ours is a history of beauty, but also of suffering. The darkest agonies of modernity played out on our bodies and souls in the middle of the last century. This is precisely why we must not become obsessed with our own suffering. When we do so, we lose the moral vision to sensitize the world to the suffering of all people, which is the only consolation for our past pain. The Torah reminds us repeatedly, "For you were strangers in the land of Egypt." And the Torah tells us, you know the suffering of the vulnerable because you were vulnerable. We redeem suffering by preventing it wherever we see it. And we must never allow our own fear or our own experience of suffering from desensitizing us to the suffering of others. Anti-Semitism continues to be a vile reality in our world, on the political right and on the political left. It is a poisonous madness about which we must be vigilant and against which we have to be prepared to fight. But this vigilance must not render us defensive and reactionary. We must stay far from the danger of believing that our past justifies a life of self-concern. If we spend the 21st century tending to our own wounds and engaging in a comparative trauma contest, we will forfeit our ability to help those who so need our story, because our story is a universal story. The Jewish story is needed to help uplift ourselves, to help heal ourselves, to help protect ourselves, but also to help heal and uplift and protect others, and to help those who are suffering and those who are vulnerable and those who are forgotten. Our suffering must not turn us inwards, but rather in the opposite direction. Lift us up with courage and openness to stare down oppression wherever we find it. So we insist that no one know the pain that we have known. Our experience of exile and our trauma has given us a unique perspective on life in this nation. No other country has given the Jewish people so much. In no other country besides Israel have the Jewish people been so welcomed and felt that their own destiny was wrapped up with the good of the larger community. As part of this process, the Jewish people have also become part of the power structure. I'm not talking about some shadowy group described in the maniacal ravings of fools and anti-Semites. I mean you and me. Jews have excelled in the professions. Our education levels, our fluency in the language of politics and communal engagement. Though most of us are not wealthy, we are deeply integrated into American society and its institutions, its economy, its politics, and its culture. Finally, the Jewish people arrived in this magnificent country at a place where we felt that we could be at rest and stop fleeing. But sometimes being at rest is precisely the danger. There's an incredible teaching in our Torah in Parshat Bo, where the plague, the death of the firstborn, is about to fall the Jewish people. Fall upon the Egyptians. And in the middle of the night, the Torah tells us that Pharaoh arose. It seems like not such a relevant, important line, but Rashi comments there, he arose from his bed. Well, what does this teach us? The Kotzko Rebbe says that even when these horrors were befalling his society, even when an enslaved people were crying out on the edge of redemption from a God who was taking their side, and even when his own people were being stricken with the death of the firstborn, and there was not a house, says the Torah, in which there was not a dead person, even at that time, Pharaoh slept comfortably. His heart was undisturbed by the suffering around him. This should serve as a warning to every person who wants to fight against Pharaoh, because Pharaoh, of course, can also be internal, the tendency to sleep peacefully when the world is on fire. So what does it mean for us to remove the crown? What does it mean for us to commit to not just murmuring the words, but actually recognizing God as sovereign with our own lives when the Machzor reminds us that that is our task? What does it mean to make our Rosh Hashanah commitments real? Leonard Label Fine, who I was blessed to know, was a beautiful writer and an important thinker in Jewish life in the late 20th century. Label once said that religion does not come to answer our questions, but to question our answers. That's a useful idea, I think, for us to have in mind. There are many ways that we can act to demonstrate our loyalty to the single truth that all things and all beings were made by God, but each of them begin with our own understanding that the social arrangement of power and wealth distribution and every form of injustice and anything that compromises the integrity of a human being, that none of those things have divine sanction. Those are the work of human hands. To remove the crown of Pharaoh means to constantly question, to hold ourselves as strangers in a strange land, to keep the prophetic distance so we can evaluate the assumptions of our society with a clear eye. We should be troublemakers, even when we disagree amongst ourselves about the answers, pushing constantly for a better world. Each of us in some way in the year 5781 has some task to play. Each of us is obligated to recognize God as sovereign in every thought and in every deed, in ways small or large, depending on the circumstances and positions of our lives. But we know that our desire for personal harmony and shalom and peace and our striving to elevate ourselves, our striving of teshuvah, cannot be separated from that. The year 5781 holds the door open for us to walk through and to recognize God as sovereign, and in that way contribute to the peace and the happiness of our own lives, the lives of all of our people, and the well-being of the world and the communities within which we live. I pray that this will be a year of blessing for you and for all of us. Shana Tova.